I'm Taylor Riggs in New York, in for Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, big tech in the firing line of the U.S. government. Apple and Google face new scrutiny over the dominance of their app stores and the fees they charge to developers. Plus, are drones the key to Amazon locking down its deliveries? We take a look at the e-commerce giant's plans. And going the distance, Peloton files its IPO paperwork, but does the home exercise startup have enough demand in the public markets? But first, to our top story, our continued look at the U.S. government's antitrust investigations into big tech. And we're looking at one market dominated in particular by Apple and Google, specifically app stores. Combined, they run the world's two biggest app stores, accounting for more than $100 billion last year. Apple has about 45% of the market and Google at 25%. And according to Sensor Tower, the two control more than 95% of all mobile app spending by U.S. consumers. Now, Apple CEO Tim Cook denied that his company has any sort of monopoly, telling CBS News that, quote, "I don't think anybody reasonable is going to come to the conclusion that Apple's a monopoly. Our share is much more modest. We don't have a dominant position in any market. You know, our share of smartphones in the U.S. is typically in the high 30s or so, mid 30s. On PCs, it's much lower than that." Joining us in San Francisco to discuss, John Berkey, the CEO and founder of Brighton AI, software company specializing in artificial intelligence for autonomous vehicles. And before that, he served on the Siri Advanced Development Group at Apple. John, great to have you. And I know we've been talking about the App Store. First, let's take a step back and walk me through why these companies have a monopoly and make your case for why they should be broken up.
Yeah, of course. So I think the market share numbers are really interesting. Within the enterprise mobile market, which where a lot of this value is, the Apple market share, if you sort of Google it, it's quite a bit higher than 30%. When I did my research, it was 85, 90%. I'm not a statistician, but these are big numbers. And I think also we have to look at that 30%. There's no cost basis to the 30%. And you have to ask yourself why Google and Apple both have the same rates. And are they really competing, or is it sort of an agreement that we're just going to charge 30%, everything's going to be good? As you know, they're making big money out of this, and until this moment, nobody's really pressed very hard.
And John,
go ahead.
Talk me through what is the standard, if you will. I mean, even on the government's website, they say being a monopoly is not illegal. And these companies have every right to pursue aggressive pricing in order to maintain a monopoly. And really only until consumers get hurt is this a problem. Are consumers hurt? These prices are free. Amazon arguably has been lowering prices for consumers. What is that like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, to your point, Amazon is another thing. I think Google and Facebook and those kind of companies are a little different too. Those are more like advertising companies. But I think, talking about Apple, I think the thing is that they didn't, they've done really well. Back in the old days when I was there the first time, we were almost dead. It was the mid-90s, and Steve had just come back, and a lot of the guys are still there from those moments, and they've done really, really well. And I think a lot of the reason why this is complicated for them emotionally is they're not used to being in this dominant position. But the question is for a company like Spotify, should they be paying Apple probably more than they pay the U.S. government, right? Because Apple gets 30% of revenue, not 30% of profit. There's no deductions, right? It seems, if you're Spotify, it seems rough to compete with your competitor and hand them 30% of your cash. So I think that's sort of to put a fine point on it. I think there's some cases like that. I think in terms of customers being harmed, without putting too fine a point on this, you'll see a lot of companies like Netflix rearrange their whole way to charge customers just to get around the Apple tax, and that's kind of strange, right? I think we all want to concentrate on making great products for the customer, and if Apple didn't have that big tax, Netflix and the other companies would make it much easier to purchase their products.
Well, given your history and experience with Apple, you know, I have to ask, what does sort of an Apple breakup look like to you? Is it separating a hardware and software? How does the App Store come into play? What are the concerns of how Apple could be split up, if at all?
Yeah, you're going to make me really popular with my friends at Apple.
That's our job here.
Yeah, right. Of course. So I think, as you know, in these kind of cases, I think there's a lot of remedies. You can imagine, for example, after some discussion, these companies just agreeing to lower their prices, lower their percentages. Or you could say, does Apple really need to have the App Store, right? Apple could be asked to let go of the App Store and be the platform company, just not do the store, right? And not charge that percentage. And then they could have some other model, right? You could see that could happen. I don't think that would be particularly damaging to Apple. And in fact, if there's a market for app stores, that'd be super interesting. I think one of the things that we notice when we use the App Store is it's not particularly good at what it does. It's hard to find products if you don't know what you're looking for. And you can imagine if there were more specialized app stores, it actually might be a better place.
John, generally speaking, what does this mean for the future of innovation? I'm thinking of a small company who expects that in a few years they could be looked at being bought out by a big company like an Apple or an Amazon. Does this make them a little bit more nervous about developing that big innovation if there isn't a good exit path for them?
Yeah, good question. Honestly, I think both the companies that you are talking about will never, not in the foreseeable future, have an issue with cash. You may remember there were a few years ago during one of America's financial crises, Apple had more money in the bank than the United States of America. So I think that it will still be true that there'll be plenty of money to purchase startups. I think on the other side, with a couple of changes, maybe there'll be more open markets for smaller companies. Some of the things that Apple does as part of its muscle memory to protect, which is a really good muscle memory. I think one of the things I want to say about this week is Apple came out really strong about privacy, and I'm personally really proud that they did that. Because as you know, not everybody does that, and this is really clearly in Tim's DNA. So I think that's really good. So I think some of that muscle memory, though, is a bit overprotective. We all do that with our children and other things, right? So Apple could open and make it a little easier to do some of these things. There's a bunch of cases that some of them are kind of technical around services and apps and things, but you could actually have a more innovative place.
John, I spoke with Scott Galloway. He's a professor over at NYU and has studied a lot of these big tech companies. He made sort of a bold prediction that within the next 5 to 10 years, instead of these big four, we really could see smaller 6 to 10 companies. Through your research and analysis, do you have any idea of how many companies this could be? Are we looking at what could be potentially up to 10 different companies?
I think it's a good question. I think when you look at the remedies for a company like Google or Facebook, you could easily see those being split up into several companies along with some remedies around, I think in Facebook, you could see digital accounting stepping in, a company like PwC or some other company stepping in and providing audits so that the user data is handled better. And then you could see that maybe that would be split. I think you have to begin with the end in mind. What do we want? I think we're proud of these amazing companies. They're a big part of why America is so strong today. But we don't want to wreck that, right? But we also want to continue to have innovation, right? And I think also we're all struggling in America with the digital divide, not just inner cities and others, but also Main Street America that's out in the middle of Iowa somewhere. So part of the stuff we're talking about here is how to make that continue to be better, right? Because we know that one of the things we're worried about with a company like Amazon is that old thing we used to call the Walmart effect, right? Which is these big companies can accidentally make small main streets worse, right? They can accidentally shut down some stores. They don't mean to do these things, So part of the remedies that we've seen in the past as well are things like, the cable companies or the phone companies are forced to run lines out to the country, right? So every American gets a chance, right? So you can see that happening with some of these things too. So you could see splitting off from the big four, big five, you could see, yeah, sure, you could see 8, 10. And then you can see, though, at second level, maybe you have 4 or 5 app store companies. Maybe you have, maybe AWS is no longer part of Amazon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who knows, But I think all of us Americans, we do like capitalism, right? I mean, not all of us, but, capitalism's a good thing generally. And so what we want it to work, right? We know that we have stories from our history books where, a big company got too powerful.
Right.
And as I said, Apple is, I think, one of those cases where they've done really well. We should let them have a victory lap, and then we should find a way. It's like playing checkers with your kid, and you're doing too well, so you sort of back off. So some of those cases are, for Apple, they can just change the field a little bit, right? Make it a little more open.
Well, wonderful insights, and thank you. That was John Berkey, CEO of Brighton AI. Good insights there. Now, YouTube is cracking down on videos that promote hate speech and extremist content. The Alphabet-owned video streaming company says it will prohibit videos with white supremacist, neo-Nazi, and conspiracy theory content against well-documented events such as Holocaust deniers and Sandy Hook truther videos. The move comes as criticism has continued to mount that YouTube is not doing enough to keep those videos from coming online. And coming up, if Amazon gets its way, you may be no longer looking out your window for the delivery man. Instead, you just might be looking up to the skies. That's next. This is Bloomberg. It was just about 6 years ago when Amazon was touting its Octocopter, a drone that was going to bring packages right to your doorstep. Well, that still hasn't come to pass, but on Wednesday, the e-commerce giant unveiled a new AI-enabled drone to use in test deliveries of small household goods. Amazon says it will be built with components designed to meet FAA regulations. Back in April, Alphabet subsidiary Wing became the first drone company to win FAA approval to operate as a small airline and is planning its own delivery tests. Joining us to discuss in Washington is Bloomberg's regulation editor, John Morgan, and on the phone, Tom Forti, senior research analyst at D.A. Davidson. Tom, thanks for joining me. I want to start with you first quickly here. Give us an update sort of on what we know about the drone so far, and more importantly in your research, how this fits into Amazon's overall strategy.
Sure. So going back in time when Amazon first talked about drone delivery on a network television show, our viewpoint was that they were trying to basically break the duopoly of FedEx and UPS to the extent that we saw and still see kind of the cost of delivery as the Achilles heel of Amazon's business model, to the extent that FedEx and UPS are able to raise their rates every year, even during the Great Recession. So I think the fact that it's taken 6 years to get this far, and I would argue this far means essentially almost like a beta test for drone delivery, suggests that the technological hurdles and the regulatory hurdles are still quite significant for this rollout. But I do think when you think about its ability to empower now one-day prime delivery and its ability to offset some of that inflationary pressure from FedEx and UPS, this is an important initiative for Amazon.
John, you heard Tom on the phone talk about regulatory hurdles. We do know that they need FAA approval. Any indication of sort of what the timeline for that might be?
No, they've been working behind the scenes. We know that the Federal Aviation Administration gave them permission to do some testing now, but they're still a ways off in coming up with the complete regulatory package that will govern how this business will be conducted. But like as often happens in these high-tech industries, the regulators and policymakers tend to stand back and sort of let the technology evolve and then come along and set some rules for the road. But so far we don't know quite when that's going to be done, but we do know they're working on it.
Tom, talk to me a little bit more about how this fits over on in Amazon. I mean, so often we talk about their high growth profits, margins like Amazon Web Services. How does this drone sort of fit into your overall thesis for the company? Where do you expect it to sort of start to make money?
Sure, so absolutely. So to the extent that Amazon is able to employ technology to materially improve their shipping costs, I think this is a big profit generating opportunity for Amazon. And if you look at their recent performance, what you're seeing is an increasing mix of third-party unit sales on the platform, which has been beneficial to their profits as they get higher margin when someone else sells on their platform and they collect a commission rather than Amazon itself. So to the extent it lowers shipping costs, I think this could be a boost to profitability.
John, talk to me a little bit more about Alphabet's Wing. We know that back in April, that was the first to get approval. Amazon really seems to trying to be playing catch up a little bit. What do we know about how different this is from Alphabet's Wing and how Alphabet had sort of been leading the stage on this?
Yeah, we've been sort of waiting for Amazon to pop up. The Alphabet had been more public. We saw those tests last year where they were delivering popsicles and burritos to in test platforms to customers. But here's Amazon, finally, the company that we most associate with the rapid delivery of consumer products, finally has rolled out this technology, which is somewhat different. If you may recall, and I think the video there reflects the Alphabet's program involved lowering the goods from a hovering drone with a sort of a rope and pulley. Amazon's taking a different approach. They're actually going to come to your lawn and land, or come within a few feet of the ground. So that required a lot more technology, and they've included some artificial intelligence that they say will allow them to spot clotheslines and pets and things like that and land safely.
Tom, I finally want to ask you, in the last conversation, we were talking about the probes and some of the antitrust and breaking up some of these monopolies. This, of course, seems to be Amazon's another foray into helping sort of gain on pricing power and sort of insulate themselves from other pricing pressures. Is this the right move at the right time? What sort of backlash do they face now, as there are some concerns about a monopoly?
Sure, so definitely. In the white paper we just published on the convergence of tech and retail, the death of Amazon, one of the things we talked about was regulatory risk. So specifically, would the company be required to separate the AWS unit from retail? We don't think that would be a material drag on the long-term performance of the stock. You'd have two good stocks instead of one. And then to the extent that I think as long as Amazon, so for example, they recently dropped the practice of requiring third-party sellers to offer products on Amazon at the lowest price point. So I think that was something where they may have been caught on antitrust. So to the extent this is more about enabling sales on Amazon, and to the extent that they offer good opportunities for third-party sellers on the platform, I don't think this would trip antitrust.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was Bloomberg's Tom Morgan and Tom Forti of D.A. Davidson. Thank you both. And coming up, e-commerce is on the rise, and with that, so is the demand for warehouse space. How online retail giants like Amazon and Walmart are shaping industrial real estate next. This is Bloomberg. Earlier this week, Blackstone Group announced it's acquiring 179 million square feet of U.S. warehouse space from Singapore's GLP. The $18.7 billion deal is one of the largest industrial real estate deals in history, but it's also a big bet on e-commerce. This is as online retailers seek more and more warehouse space to expand their digital operations and cut delivery times. Joining us from Seattle to discuss is Cushman & Wakefield Senior Managing Director Ben Conwell. Ben, I imagine this is just one step in what is otherwise a much needed trend that we've been waiting for.
Well, you're right. And good afternoon, Taylor. Thanks for having me. This is one indication. It's one transaction, albeit a significant one. It's consistent with what we see at Cushman & Wakefield nationally and even globally, of sophisticated institutional capital that invest in different types of real estate, making very, very bold, very strong moves to build their logistics asset portfolio. So this is clearly an indication of what we see, not always at this scale, but certainly the investment thesis is the same.
What types of industrial warehouses and real estate deals are you seeing the most demand right now? Can you categorize it by deals that are over a certain million square feet or certain neighborhoods and urban areas to speed up delivery times? What types of these deals are seeing the most demand right now?
Sure. We see it really spread across three different kinds of logistics assets. And the first is that kind of building that gets so much publicity and media coverage. That's the large e-commerce fulfillment center that is 800,000 square feet, 900,000 square feet, or even well over 1 million square feet. And these are buildings that employ a tremendous amount of technology. They're extremely expensive to develop, and they employ a significant number of people. That's part one. Part two is because successful online retailers and even legacy physical retailers are constantly trying to bring more inventory closer to the consumer. That's driving a movement for smaller fulfillment centers, more in the range of 200, 300, or 400,000 square feet, deeper into urban areas. And then the third, that probably has more buzz now than the other two, is in the last mile. It's the last touch point, if you will, the last transfer point for orders through the delivery chain before they go out for final delivery to your house or to your office. So we see investor interest in all three of those categories.
Ben, how has interest been recently? And I wonder if we made the move fast enough to convert what was either a retail mom and pop shop or retail store. I mean, for example, I walk up 3rd Avenue and 79th Street and an old retail shop that used to be there is empty. Have we converted those fast enough into repurposing them, into bringing them up to modern use?
Yeah, it's a very hot area in the investment field right now, that conversion opportunity of taking underperforming retail real estate assets and repurposing them for logistics among other users. Today, we're still in the very early stages of that, of logistics space available in the U.S. today. Only a very, very small percentage is the conversion of former retail assets. I think we'll see more of that as we go along, and smart capital is looking hard at opportunities to invest in that conversion.
Ben, talk to me quickly about geographics. You're in Seattle. We know big real estate prices thanks in part to Amazon. What regions are seeing the hottest trends?
Well, we see it historically. Typically, we see this kind of investment interest in the major distribution markets nationally. Generally ports, LA, Long Beach, Dallas, Atlanta, Miami, Chicago, New York, New Jersey. But with the increased demand from investment capital to find logistics assets for their portfolios, we're seeing more and more movement to what we used to call alternative cities, but today are getting significant activity.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was Ben Cromwell over at Cushman & Wakefield, the Senior Managing Director. And coming up, more tech companies are caught in the fray after the U.S. blocked Huawei from buying U.S. technology. We discuss the battle next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Taylor Riggs in New York. The battle over trade and technology between the world's two biggest economies has entered a new phase, with allegations China reneged on commitments made at the negotiating table, triggering a fresh round of tariffs and smashing months-long detente. So where do we go from here? Let's bring in Ron Gula, president of Gula Technologies. He is also an advisor to U.S. congressional staff on tech policy and cybersecurity as a global fellow for the Wilson Center. Ron, great to have you here. I wonder, from where you're sitting there in D.C., was this the right approach to really get China to sit up and pay attention?
Yeah, block and ban Huawei is definitely the right approach for this administration, because we're really facing two forms of espionage. There's economic espionage performed directly by Huawei against U.S. companies such as T-Mobile, and there's also nation-state espionage conducted by China, both in cyber and many other facets. So it's definitely the right policy at the right time, and it puts a lot of pressure on China during these trade negotiations.
Well, Ron, I'm going to push back a little bit because I've heard a lot of analysts come here and say that Huawei really is a separate issue from trade, that trade and tariffs is one thing and Huawei is a national security issue, and conflating those two is confusing and not appropriate. Is it appropriate to be putting Huawei in here as leverage for trade?
It's definitely appropriate because in China's case, when they perform intelligence gathering, they use it for the benefit of their companies and their economy. So all forms of intelligence from China are definitely national security issues. And we really haven't been able to do much as an industry. You know, companies like T-Mobile, people who've been victims of espionage from Huawei, they don't have a whole lot of recourse. So this is a very, very crucial thing that the White House has done.
You talk about how it puts pressure on China. What have you heard from U.S. tech companies in terms of the backlash that they've now experienced and maybe some of the pressure that they are feeling?
So, you know, the ban's two ways. Not only can U.S. companies not buy Huawei, but you can't sell components to that. So this impacts both Google, who makes the Android operating system, as well as chip manufacturers. But anybody who's doing business with China has been sort of put on notice that this is something that this administration takes very seriously. And it's also been done on the heels of bans such as Kaspersky, the Russian antivirus company, by the U.S. government.
You mentioned T-Mobile and AT&T and Verizon and some of these other companies. How much does this help them in the long-awaited and long-watched race to 5G?
So I think it helps U.S. manufacturers because we want to keep U.S. companies part of the 5G infrastructure. And 5G is not just a new, faster phone. It's going to change the way the U.S. uses the internet. It's going to change, for example, the death of Wi-Fi. You're not going to have Wi-Fi in your house. Everything's going to be connected directly to the internet. And banning Huawei at this time, it's not just banning their components in the network, it's banning their cloud components as well. So yes, it does benefit U.S. companies, but it really makes sure that these very, very important services are done with U.S. manufacturers and U.S. businesses.
Well, and Ron, we can sort of fold this into a cybersecurity conversation, and we often talk to analysts and we say that the next war that will be fought will not be a traditional war, but it will be one that we play through cybersecurity. What conversations are you having in D.C. with congressional leaders and the Trump administration about how we stay ahead in the cybersecurity war?
So when I meet with people here in Washington, D.C., I talk about something called the cyber poverty line. And basically, it's a line where above it, you have organizations that, you know, they have everything they want. They have every cyber product they ever want, and they're still not secure. So they hire hundreds, maybe even 1,000 people to look for hackers and attacks that are getting through. People below the poverty line, you know, small schools, you and me at our house, we really don't have the ability to keep ourselves, you know, that secure. I mean, the internet's made on insecure components to begin with. So with that kind of frame, you're really running into two issues. One, keep our very, very bad adversaries, Russia and China, at bay. And two, for everybody else, we really need to do education of the average citizen. Most people do not know what their data is worth or how the internet actually even works, and to be able to make decisions about what they should buy.
Well,
so that's where I think...
Sorry, go ahead.
I said, and that's where a lot of the focus is. What can we do to both raise awareness of the average U.S. citizen so they can be smart, make smarter decisions in cyberspace, but also what can we do to really put pressure on China and Russia to stop messing with the U.S. cyberspace?
Well, I was cutting you off on the point where you mentioned that we don't know what our data is worth, because that leads me to a broader conversation we've been having all week, of course, with the DOJ talking about antitrust probes into some of the big tech companies and breaking up what seems to be a big monopolies. And I wonder what's your take on that? Has this shown that some of these companies are unable to protect our data, and so it really is the government's job now to step in to protect the consumer's data?
So I'm not a trade expert or monopoly expert, but what I like to tell people in this case is that in the airline industry, there's a tremendous amount of oversight. There's a tremendous amount of regulation. There's a tremendous amount of control, because we're literally putting our lives in the hands of the airplane manufacturers. With cyberspace, you know, we're literally putting our digital lives in the hands of these organizations, sometimes for free, sometimes we're paying them to do so. And, you know, what they do with that is a little bit different than what we think we're doing that. So there's got to be a change. The problem is we got here over the last 20 years, and unrolling how do you separate my data from Facebook or my data from LinkedIn or these other services is really a difficult problem, especially in the face of these new privacy regulations, such as what's come out of Europe, the GDPR, as well as the state of California.
Well, some difficult problems with some difficult solutions and conversations. Thank you. That was Ron Gula in Washington of Gula Technologies. Now, as we have been covering on Bloomberg, the House panel is conducting an antitrust investigation of these big technology firms, and it is prepared to issue subpoenas focusing on the impacts of digital platforms on news organizations. Bloomberg's Kevin Cirilli spoke with the lawmaker leading the probe, that is Democratic Congressman David Cicilline.
This is a review broadly of the dominant technology platforms in the digital marketplace to look at how they're operating, whether or not they are providing a context for sufficient competition, whether they're engaged in anti-competitive behavior, whether they're engaged in behavior which is discouraging or eliminating competitors, whether they're discouraging innovation and entrepreneurship, whether they're having a proper regard for the privacy interests of their users, and whether or not they allow users to really control their own data. So there are a number of really important issues, but this is an opportunity to use the investigative process, which will involve depositions and hearings,
subpoenas,
and witnesses, and if necessary, subpoenas, document requests, roundtables. We'll bring in some of the best technologists in the country who have been doing a lot of thinking about what's the right response, what are the right answers. I think it's easy to identify the challenges and the big problems. It's harder to come up with the solutions, and so we want to be sure that we have the best data, the best thinking, the most accurate information as we develop solutions to these
I'm struck by this because so much of the rhetoric, break up big tech, and there's all of these different rhetoric on the right and the left. But if necessary, Congressman, would you change the statutes to break up some of these big tech companies?
I think there's no question that one of the things we will look at very carefully is whether or not the existing antitrust statutes are sufficient to protect the kind of competition at issue here. It's important to remember those antitrust statutes were drafted principally during the railroad monopolies, which was a very different economy, and it might be time to update them and modernize them and think, are they working effectively in the 21st century? What's also exciting is this is a bipartisan investigation. There's Republican and Democratic support for doing this in a thoughtful, responsible way. There may not be agreement with every solution at the conclusion of it, but I think people recognize that it matters to constituents all across the country.
That was Congressman David Cicilline speaking to Bloomberg's Kevin Cirilli. Meanwhile, the UK government wants clarity on the US's plan to ban Huawei. A UK delegation is headed to the US to figure out how that export ban on Huawei will affect companies overseas. Two British officials said their government had no advance notice of the Trump administration's actions, and the ban has further delayed the UK's own decision on whether to allow the Chinese company to supply 5G phone networks. Britain is conducting a review of the telecom supply chain that was originally due for publication in the first quarter of this year, but has been pushed indefinitely back. And coming up, Melinda Gates is using her platform to speak out against inequality. Will other wealthy tech titans follow? This is Bloomberg.
Bill and Warren and I believe that we should not have this inequity that exists in the United States. We need to do something about that. Philanthropy with government, with a private sector, with a non-governmental organization, that set of partnerships and that ecosystem can do the best for the world.
The home cycling startup Peloton has filed confidentially for an IPO. Bloomberg has learned that a listing could value the company more than $8 billion. Peloton sells exercise bikes and treadmills with tablets that stream live fitness classes. For more, we're joined by Bloomberg Deals reporter Crystal Say. So, what do we know so far? From what I was looking at this statement, we didn't even quite know the number of shares that were going to be listed, but bring us up to date. What do we know?
Well, we know that Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan are leading this deal. But what we don't know, like you said, is that the shares, the price, and the valuation, we have heard previously that it will be more than $8 billion. And the more details of the deal will come later. But what we'll be very interested to see is what is in the risk factor, because They recently had a lawsuit where music labels sued them for copyright infringement for using some of the songs without paying royalty. So there are little problems like this along the way that we should watch for. But apart from that, this is a very exciting listing. It's a brand that's known to a lot of people, so we'll be closely watching.
Talk to me about that valuation, because as we were here just this year looking at Lyft and Uber, a lot of the concerns were these big tech unicorns that frankly got above themselves, and those IPOs and those valuations had to come back down to earth. What does this $8 billion valuation on Peloton say about where we are right now?
So obviously this is a big year for tech listing, and we can look at Peloton as one of them. At Uber listing, there are a lot of talks about how this is really overvalued, but today we've seen Uber coming back to its offer price, $45 for the first time since listing. So maybe that price after all reflects the true value of what Uber is worth. So for this $8 billion, it's actually more than $8 billion that they're actually looking at. Will be very exciting to see, whether bankers or investors, how they interpret that number. But for reference, the latest round, which is last year in the private market, valued them at around $4.1 billion. Oh. So this would be a big jump from the private value.
I'm sure we will be scouring through those documents, and in particular, one thing that you had highlighted was those risk factors. That sort of makes me wonder, what are those risk factors? A lot of the consumers of Peloton, I wonder, are the competitors. I think of a few over here in Midtown where you can go and take cycling classes, but you don't necessarily have an at-home bike. Is Peloton trying to get you to give up those classes to buy a Peloton and to take those classes at your home?
In fact, they actually have studios as well. So Peloton is trying to get consumers to get out of their home, go to the studios, and participate with other people. So this is not really, apart from that home exercise play, they're trying to get it more sociable. And this actually is, they have corporate partnerships, they have the bikes and treadmills and hotel chains. So I think this is not really, it's not going to be, they're going to diversify, the client base and where the bikes are going to be outside of homes.
Another story that we've been following is over in Shanghai, where the Shanghai Exchange has now approved 3 new IPOs for this new tech board. What is a tech board?
It's essentially a Chinese version of NASDAQ.
Okay.
It's an initiative from the very top down. Chinese President Xi Jinping himself mentioned this for the very first time in a summit a few months back. So for China, this is a mission that they need to complete and they need to do well. And so far we're seeing that for the first time they've approved 3 applicants, and most of the applicants in the pipeline are hardware companies, not really the internet techy companies that we were expecting, but good revenue and good profit, so potentially would be a good first batch candidate.
Well, and certainly a lot going on within the tech world. Thank you. That was Bloomberg's Crystal Say. Meanwhile, Melinda Gates of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation sat down with David Rubenstein for a wide-ranging conversation about the foundation and its $50 billion in assets, plus how she's tried to keep her children grounded amidst their wealth, and when she met her husband and Microsoft founder, Bill Gates. Take a listen.
When did you first meet Bill?
So I actually first met Bill, 3 weeks into my job. I'd never been to New York City. I'd never hailed a cab. Microsoft sent me to New York for a business meeting. And so my female roommate, Microsoft used to make you have another roommate when you went traveling on the road. My female roommate said, hey, when you're done with your business meeting across town, why don't you come to this dinner? And I said, great. Came from across town, sat down at a dinner. There were 2 chairs open because I came late from this meeting that I was at, and I sat down. Next chair was empty. 10 minutes later, Bill came in, sat down next to me. And so that's when I first met Bill, about 3 weeks into the job.
And he said, wow, how about getting to know me better? He didn't say that then?
He sort of said, a bunch of us are going out dancing tonight. Why don't you come? And I said, well, I actually have some other plans from somebody I knew from business school tonight. And then back at Microsoft a few months later, everybody back then used to work late on Friday nights, quite late on Saturday. You'd work till about 3 or 4 o'clock. And so my car was parked next to his in a parking lot, and he struck up a conversation, and we talked for a while. And then he said, he asked me if I would go out with him eventually. This was a Saturday, 2 weeks from Friday night. And I said, 2 weeks from Friday night? Like, I was 22 years old. I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing 2 weeks from Friday night. I said, that's not quite spontaneous enough for me. And he said, okay, well, will you give me, can I take your phone number? So he did. Called me about an hour later at my apartment and said, well, is this spontaneous enough for you? How about tonight? But then he said, but I have a user group meeting and a dinner I have to go to. So how about a glass of wine downtown? And I thought, a user group meeting on a Saturday night. But I agreed to meet him for a glass of wine. And that was our first date.
And you can watch the full interview with Melinda Gates on the David Rubenstein Show tonight, 9 p.m. in New York on Bloomberg TV. And still ahead, HP's lawsuit against Autonomy founder Mike Lynch is heating up. We'll discuss the latest in the trial next. This is Bloomberg. Oracle announced Wednesday that it has secured a cloud computing alliance with Microsoft. The software makers will connect their data centers so customers can more easily move workloads between the two. The partnership will help Oracle preserve its database business and make its software applications more attractive to companies that may be considering a move to Microsoft's Azure. Similar partnerships have helped Microsoft thrive as the #2 provider of cloud storage behind Amazon. And former Hewlett-Packard CEO Meg Whitman gave her first testimony in the company's lawsuit against Autonomy founder Mike Lynch Wednesday. HP is suing Lynch over claims he regularly inflated his company's sales. In court Wednesday, Whitman acknowledged that she was prepared to throw her predecessor, Leo Apotheker, under the bus for the failed Autonomy deal. This is in reference to an email from 2011 where she said she was happy to do it in a tit for tat. She told the court, quote, "It was a moment of anger and disappointment about what happened here, and I shouldn't have said it." Joining us to discuss is Bloomberg's Nico Grant in San Francisco. Nico, just give me the latest. I'm new. I have not been following this case. What new did we learn today?
So, Taylor, thank you for having me. Meg Whitman said out loud what, one could surmise she would think privately. And that's what's so unusual because she does have this reputation for being small c conservative and very calm and rational in her demeanor. But basically, we got insight today into just how dysfunctional Hewlett-Packard was in the time around the deal and just after, when it was making a transition from CEO Leo Apotheker to Meg Whitman. In particular, we learned that the board was very dysfunctional. The board had wavered on whether or not it was a good idea for HP to buy Autonomy, and then also insight into what happened when Meg Whitman started to look at this software asset her predecessor had bought, and this was the beginning of the end for Mike Lynch, who was then fired by Meg Whitman.
Talk to me more about that dysfunction between the executives and the board. I believe I read that they had unanimously approved this deal, but then, of course, under the papers a little bit, you read about some more skirmishes that were happening. How dysfunctional was this board at the time?
HP's board was infamously dysfunctional around this time. This is a board that had fired Carly Fiorina years before, had then fired Mark Hurd over an expense issue. This was a board that, from reporting that I have done, really was interested in seeing HP be this big supermarket of a tech company in which it could own any type of asset and then sell it to its customers. And so there was great interest, particularly during Leo Apotheker's tenure, for HP to be this IBM-like business that could sell software. But then, when it turned out that this was a bad deal and the Autonomy was a paper tiger, that's when the infighting began, and the question became, how can we spread this blame? And of course, Whitman, even though she had to clean up the mess of Apotheker, also has some measure of blame because she was one of the directors on the board of HP at the time.
Nico, any big backlash for Meg Whitman from these comments today?
None that I have seen. I think that Meg Whitman at this point has, sort of earned her reputation for better and for worse. But right now she's focused on running Quibi, this new micro entertainment competitor to Netflix, and so I haven't seen any backlash.
Thank you. That was Bloomberg's Nico Grant. Thanks for joining us. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. Remember, we're live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology. Be sure to follow our breaking news network at TikTok on Twitter. This is Bloomberg.